We're here at the Island Lake Conservation Area, and it's right near Orangeville, and we're at the annual Maple Syrup Festival. And with me today, I have the Credit Valley Conservation Superintendent, Yasmin Slater.
Hi.
Hi.
Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for welcoming us. We are so thrilled to be here today. I want you to try to give us an overview of just exactly what you have running here for people today.
Yeah, sure. So you get to try to tap some trees, so using some tools for that. We talk about the signs of spring. We do a little bit of sweetwater discovery, a little bit of early settlers, and talk about changing seasons, so what the future brings for maple syrup production. And then we get to experience our sugar shack where the evaporator's going and gets nice and warm and toasty in there.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Let's get started.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay.
Great.
Well, I've got John with me here from the Credit Valley Conservation Area, and he is at station number one of the 6-station tour. And John, can you give us kind of a brief overview of what you tell people at this station?
Yes, so this is our tapping demonstration station. This is our first stop in our maple syrup journey.
Right.
So the first thing we have to do when we're collecting and making our maple syrup, tap our trees.
Of course.
Before we can do that, we have to measure our trees. We want to make sure the trees are the right size so we're not damaging or causing any long-term damage to the trees going forward. And
So what's the minimum size then that you would need?
80 centimeters, the trees have to be in diameter, and then we can start drilling. And the bigger the tree is, the more buckets we can hang from the tree in order to collect sap.
Okay, so how many buckets per centimeter sort of thing?
That's a good question. It's 80 centimeters for one bucket, about 90 centimeters for two buckets, and then up to 190 centimeters, you can start hanging 4 buckets. And that's
Okay.
about the maximum that we would go.
Now, I think of sap in a tree kind of like the tree's blood, and yet here we're taking sap out of the tree. How much can you take before you do damage?
It's actually kind of like donating blood, so it's not harmful to the trees. We're taking an amount that's not going to cause any damage further on. In a season, I think we made 75 liters of maple syrup last year here at the park.
Right.
And it takes about 40 liters of sap in order to make 1 liter of maple syrup.
40 to 1.
40 to 1. So I can't do the math in my head that quickly, but quite a bit of sap, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're at the next stage of our Sugar Bush tour here at the Island Lake Conservation Area near Orangeville. And we are with Thomas, who's going to tell us, I hope, all about how the settlers managed to gather and consume maple syrup.
All right. So the settlers learned a lot from indigenous people. They got a lot of indigenous knowledge, but they had the distinct advantage that they had access to metal, and metal made their lives a lot easier. But even with the help of metal, it was still a whole family operation. Everybody played a specific role. The men would go into the sugar bush and tap the trees and hang up the buckets. The children would collect the sap using a yoke just like this, and they would bring it back to the fire, where the women would keep close watch over the kettles, and they would boil the sap down and turn it into maple syrup. At the final pot, the grandmother would keep close watch because she was the most experienced woman, and only when she said it was ready would it be passed through the filter into the final bucket where you could enjoy it. If you like, you can also boil it down further until the sugar crystallizes and turn it into maple sugar. The maple sugar could be used to sweeten food, in baking products, and it can be embossed with the seal of the family in order to brand their sugar product.
Very, very good. How long did the process take once they started to boil down the raw syrup, the raw sap?
So the sap is about 97% water at this stage. They boil in 3 buckets because they need to concentrate the sugar as we go along the process. And depending on the speed of the fire, the heat of the fire, and the size of the bucket, you could boil a batch down quite quickly. But it takes 40 buckets of sap to make 1 bucket of maple syrup. So you would be topping that first bucket up fairly often. And once you've filled that up and boiled away 40 buckets, you would have 1 bucket of maple syrup. So it could take a long time if you're doing a large batch.
So for the next segment of our tour, we're with Jane, and Jane's at the flat pan. What is that all about?
Well, the flat pan was the method that was used after the Industrial Revolution. So we were able to use metal in this way, so sheet metal. At the previous station, we would have had kettles. Obviously, this is a whole lot more efficient because now we've got lots and lots of steam, lots of sap. Steam from the sap is evaporating much more quickly. So this process was a whole lot faster and more efficient than the kettles that you might have seen earlier.
You're talking about, what, 3 or 4 times faster than the kettles?
Easily, yes, yeah. You can tell just by looking at all the steam that's coming off. We have a long, low fire that's underneath the flat pan, so that's creating lots and lots of heat. And of course, then that allows lots of evaporation to happen. So yeah, much faster.
Now, is that some kind of a steam stack at the end?
Well, that's the chimney for the smoke. Yeah, so the smoke's going out the back. A lot of folks are still using this method, so if you're perhaps only tapping maybe 20 or 30 of your own trees, then this would be a method that you would still be using today, the flat pan method.
And what method is used to get the final maple syrup out of that flat pan?
Right. Well, you could boil it right down till it was at that 66%.
Right.
I know a lot of families, my grandpa, for example, he would take the last sort of that finishing stage. He would then use just over on a stove element and kind of heat it down so he could watch it really carefully because, of course, you don't want to burn it when it gets to that last step. So yeah, that was the method.
Do you have any sense of through the season how much wood would be used and consumed to be able to produce the maple syrup?
A lot of wood, absolutely. Yeah, that was part of the whole process, getting prepared in the winter, making sure you've got a good stack of wood because it's going to take a lot. Some of the folks that use this method would actually stay up 24 hours. They would stay up overnight, and that would kind of be the final finishing off. So obviously keeping a fire going for 24 hours is going to use a lot of wood.
We're at the last stage of our tour at the conservation area outside of Orangeville, and I'm with Alyssa in the Sugar Shack.
Well, welcome to our maple sauna. Thanks for coming to our Sugar Shack here. We've let out a little bit of steam, so hopefully you can see us okay here. But on your way, I'm sure you saw quite a few of our buckets outside, just like these aluminum pails. Just like this, we have 50 of those out in our sugar bush. And then we have about 50 other sap lines running up what we're calling Sugar Mountain up that way. So all of that sap gets gathered and comes down through gravity feed or through manual labor and eventually gets pumped up into our white tank on the outside of the building and then gets fed into our evaporator. Now, I want to introduce you all to Eva. Eva is our wood-fired traditional evaporator. So she gets fed firewood found from our conservation areas. A lot of trees that have had to come down anyway. Ash with the emerald ash borer is a common one. And so we have to feed Eva about every 10 minutes. Now, some of the things that make her a little bit more efficient than the flat pan that you saw out that way would be this steam hood or the pre-warmer. So if you can see with my maple wand, I'll see if I can open this up a little bit here. But there's some stainless steel tubes in there. So the sap entering into the evaporator isn't quite 2 degrees Celsius. It was actually frozen this morning, but it warms up to about 70 degrees Celsius before it enters into our flue pan down below. And I'll show you, I don't know if you can see through the steam, but it's called a flue pan because we have these channels. Watch my maple wand here. So sap will enter about 3% sugar, and it'll flow in this direction, kind of like an S, all the way through, coming down this way into our syrup pans. So it's getting pretty close to maple syrup. We don't actually finish it on here because we don't want to burn anything. So we use temperature to draw off of the evaporator, and we filter. So we use these cone filters, felt filters, and pre-filters to filter out niter sand and other particulates. Now, I wish I had a sample here to show you of our niter sand, but it's pretty cold today, and so our bottle kind of exploded. But a couple reasons why we filter, because it looks a lot better, but also, if we didn't, it increases the risk of these sugar crystals forming. Now, this is completely fine to eat, but I don't know about you, but I'd like to get all the sugar out of that bottle. So if we didn't filter, there'd be particles down here, and it creates a nucleation point for all that sugar to form. And so that's one of the reasons why. So once we filter for the first time, we actually finish on the stove. You probably can't see behind me with the steam. We finish on the stove over that way, and we filter again before we bottle. Now, maple sugar, or maple syrup is considered when it's upwards of 66.7% sugar. Now, we use either a refractometer to determine this. So this little tool here, we put a little droplet of maple syrup, and we'd hold it up to the light, and there's a prism in here, so it bends or refracts light, and it gives us a reading in Brix. So we're looking for 66 or upwards of that. We also have a hydrometer, so we could take a sample here and a little float, and it would give us a specific gravity of how much sugar we have. So then, once we know that it's maple syrup, we bottle. And so this is something that we bottled last year, nice and clear. And then we have the opportunity, we could grade maple syrup. So we put a little sample in this jar here and hold it up to the light. Today there are some digital mass spectrometers that could determine the opacity. But this is the first grade of syrup that you usually get in the season. This is called golden, nice delicate flavor. And as the season goes on, it tends to get darker here. So the next grade is amber. Pretty creative with their grading names. This one's a little bit darker, so do you know what this one's called? Dark. And then very creative again. If that one's dark and this one's a little bit darker, this one's called very dark.
Very nice.
So this one's my favorite here. It has the stronger maple flavor. I wouldn't turn down any of these maple syrups, but I would put this on anything. So some of the reasons why we have different grades of maple syrup. In the season, the trees usually produce a little bit more sugar in its sap than it does later on. So we have to boil it a little bit longer for us to create a darker maple syrup. There's a little bit more caramelization happening. But there's also other things produced by the trees later on in the syrup, or in the season. So it's a little simpler here, and there's more complex flavors as it goes on. And also, as the sap sits a little bit longer, it oxidizes. So that's why we have a bit darker syrup there. Are there any questions about the process at all?
Well, certainly, I'd like to know, since all trees, maple trees, have syrup, what makes the sugar maple different, apart from the fact that we already know we get maple syrup from it? How does it differ from the other maples?
So that's a really good question. So say silver maple, you can produce maple syrup from a silver maple tree. It gives you a little bit different flavor, but the sugar maple actually has more sugar content. Aptly, the name sugar maple has higher sugar concentration in general than other maple trees.
And in terms of the season, we know that sugar maples have sap in them 12 months of the year. What makes harvesting in the spring so special?
So the temperature. So some people actually this year, it's been a strange season, actually tap their trees in January. It's those temperatures. So you're wanting the -5 nights and those +5 days that gives us that pressure from the sap that flows from the roots up to the top. So it's the temperature basically.
People, right?
So imagine we had drawn off of the evaporator. It's not quite maple syrup, but it's not sap coming out of the tree. So I'd say it's about maybe 15 to 20% sugar that you have there. So it's a little watery, warm treat for you to have.
You can get some more.
It's pretty special me being here for this because I started maple syrup when I was actually in grade 1 here.
Oh,
Greg
wow.
Reiki was the outdoor education instructor.
Oh my gosh.
And so I went home and I said, you know what, I have to start doing this. And we tapped 3 trees and I've been making maple syrup ever since. So it's pretty special.
That's pretty lovely.
Yeah. So.
Good for you.
Oh, thank you. It's a labor of love, right?
Yeah.
You're addicted to
At this stage of our tour in the sugar bush, I'm about to find out about how the indigenous people of the land discovered the magic that the sugar maples could produce for us. What do you think ever possessed the indigenous people to start to tap trees, Thomas?
So I can't speak for everyone when I say this, but there's all sorts of natural other animals that enjoy the sap from the tree. So if I think about different animals that tap into the tree, the first thing I think about is the woodpecker. So if I ever were to see a woodpecker tapping in the tree, a sugar maple tree for instance, and I were to notice sap coming out, if I ever were to taste that sap, if I was thirsty, I might notice a slight sugary flavor, slight flavor of maple, and that would prompt me to tap into the tree further and get more of that out and turn it into maple syrup.
So I guess the next question might be, why would they decide to heat that syrup?
Right, so the process of heating the syrup turns the watery sap, because when the sap first comes out of the tree, it's very watery. It's 97% water and 3% sugar. But if you taste that sugar, you know you want more of it, right? So to concentrate the sugar, they would boil the sap and they would evaporate away the water, leaving behind a more and more concentrated product until at the very end they have syrup, or if they go all the way and get rid of all the fluid, all the water, they would end up with maple sugar.
So it was kind of a logical next step.
Yes, exactly.
Right. And how did they go about heating the syrup then and not losing it?
Right, so one potential method that they could have used is the clay pot method. So I have a clay pot here. I would put my sap in the clay pot, and as I said, I would heat it up. And to do that, I would have my hot rocks that I would put around the clay pot, and that would begin to heat the sap. The water would begin to evaporate, and the roughness inside of the pot helps the syrup to bubble, and the bubbles help the syrup stir, and it helps it to flow, and that makes sure that nothing is burning. And when that's ready, once my clay pot is ready, once my sap has been turned into syrup or sugar, I can pour it out in my trough and wait for it to cool down.
Okay, that's great. What else can you tell us about what's going on at this station today?
So I'll start by mentioning how the sap was actually collected. The tip of an antler of a deer was used, and the sugar maple would be scored with the tip, and then a spile would be inserted, but this would be a wood spile, either cedar or sumac, and that would direct the sap out of the tree into a birch bucket like this. The birch bark is waterproof, and you could peel it off of any birch tree, so it's easy to get and it's very useful. And another interesting thing is the calendar. Some groups used the back of a turtle shell to demarcate their different months based on the moons. So this would be the maple moon. There's also the strawberry moon, and following the maple moon is the sucker moon because of the white sucker fish that goes up the rivers at that time.
Well, I think no tour of the sugar bush would be really complete without talking about the environment, it seems to me, because of course we're working in nature. And so Jane has come along from the flat pan area to tell us about how the environment and the picture of the environment fits into all of what we're doing in the sugar bush.
Well, a lot of our maple syrup producers are quite concerned about how weather is impacting on our trees. So, for example, you see here lots of different examples of extreme weather with climate change and our changing environment. Trees are having to deal with drought, so really dry periods, also flooding. Ice damage in the winter and high winds. Even today we're having a lot of wind, so that really stresses out the apple tree, or the maple tree. We have lots of branches coming down on the trees. Maple trees do not like to have their roots lying in water. They prefer well-drained soil, so that stresses them out as well. And of course, if we're not having consistent winter snow coverage, then the trees' roots aren't being insulated as well. So that's impacting the health of our trees, absolutely. And of course, we also have the spongy moth who has arrived, one of our invasive species that's impacting our maple trees absolutely. You can see the caterpillars here from the spongy moth. They're able to eat up to 1 meter of leaves. from a tree, and the females lay a number of eggs. So if there are a lot of caterpillars, that's going to really damage and defoliate the trees.
We can do a lot, broadly speaking, to make sure that we're not damaging the environment any more than it already is, and even trying to rehabilitate. But are there any specific things that people who are interested in collecting maple syrup can do in order to stem the tide of what's going on with the environment?
Absolutely. Planting trees is a wonderful thing to do. We can add to our environment is planting more trees. If you are finding any of these creatures on your trees at home, you can always have a bucket of soapy water, place the caterpillars in with a lid, and that's one way to help control the damage that those caterpillars are causing. That's certainly something we can do, and of course supporting our local maple syrup producers as well by buying maple syrup and enjoying it.
Of course. Cheers.
Cheers.
Yeah. Worth the wait.